We've got neo-Marxism, radical gender theory, ideology, and abortion everywhere. But I'm getting ahead of myself. RTS on their website, their ethos states this: at RTS, we want to prepare winsomely reformed servants of the Lord. The RTS ethos combines things that are unique in theological education in our time: a robust commitment to confessional reform theology with a winsome, happy, positive posture. RTS was winsome, this is on there, I'm still quoting, RTS was winsome before winsome was either cool or controversial. We love and care about truth, doctrine, and theology, and we also care about producing godly, loving people who will serve the Lord and His church in such a way to commend the faith with their lips and lives, their conviction and character. Still quoting. Some seminaries are winsome but not reformed. Others are reformed but not winsome. We want to do both. That's why our motto is a mind for truth, a heart for God, a life for ministry. We want to model and commend and embody truth, love, and mission. We want to graduate students who have a theological backbone, tender hearts, and a bent to serve. All well and good. Like, many of us would agree with much of that. What they want to do, and this is under their ethos section, is marry a certain posture with the faith in order to represent the faith well. The goal is to present the faith so it creates a certain ethos in the perception of the hearer. They want the hearer to have a certain vibe of the faith communicated to them. Michael Kruger, the president of RTS Charlotte, wrote in October of 2020, so fairly recently, we should be winsome, simply because it reflects the kind of character that God asks us to have. Indeed, biblically speaking, it reflects the character of Christ. He goes on to say that the opposite of winsome, is belligerent. He says that anyone who would reject winsomeness must have a Napoleon complex, and says people who are winsome actually trust God. He says we're to shine brightly rather than shout the loudest. Now, if RTS is the institution best associated with popularizing the term winsomeness, then perhaps no preacher is most associated with the concept as Tim Keller. Starting a church in New York City in the 1980s is no small feat. He's done a lot of work, written numerous books, many New York Times bestsellers. He formed a church planting network called Redeemer City to City, and an institution called the Gospel Coalition with D.A. Carson, with a bunch of people who are gospel-centered. And there's no doubt that Tim Keller is a legend for many, including myself, and an inspiration for many church planters today. In each of these institutions he's done, and his ministry legacy is marked by this strategy of evangelism called winsomeness. One characteristic of this model of Keller's winsome approach is to avoid partisanship by taking what's called a third way. Maybe you've heard of this. The third way approach. This is commonly employed. What is the third way approach? The way I think of it is like a subcategory of winsomeness. So you've got winsomeness as a posture. Third way is a rhetorical technique. Think of winsomeness as their foreign policy. Third wayism is their trade agreement with other nations. It is a rhetorical strategy where a middle way is constructed between opposed points of view, two of them typically. It tries to find a third way between two perspectives that are opposite. You want to navigate the middle, as if somehow the middle is always best. Now, what's funny about this is actually an interesting sermon prep technique that your pastor may use every once in a while. So your pastor may get himself stuck in an Old Testament passage or in the New Testament. Go, you know what? How can I communicate this truth best? I'm going to talk about two ditches. I'm going to do the two ditches method. I'm going to say there's a ditch on both sides of the road, and we're going to stay with Jesus in the middle. And that's useful. Okay, that can be a useful pedagogical method. You can use that as a rhetorical technique. There's a way to do that. In fact, Jesus himself used this technique sometimes, so it's not necessarily wrong. I mean, Jesus himself did it, and that's going to be the standard we're going to look to when we do this kind of thing. He talked about the older brother, right, and the prodigal son, and neither of them are right. And so there's a way to use their situations where this could be a useful rhetorical strategy. But typically what it seeks to do is resolve tension and moral dilemmas. It really arose out of like our modern period, which paints in very black and white terms, out of the Enlightenment, which is all about facts, separating facts from values, either this or that. You need proof. Then postmodernism comes along as a critique, but really just embraces the same assumptions. What third wayism tends to do as a strategy, though, is it tends to create new orthodoxies out of tensions, many times false dilemmas, in our postmodern world by blending them and finding a middle way. This all preys on a deeper problem in evangelicalism, which is antinomianism, which is no law. where we diminish and dismiss the law of God. We don't understand it. Given the context of evangelical culture, when we read the Old Testament, we have no idea what's up and down. The way I think of it is like this, like a topographic map. In Colorado, where we're pastors, you can go to a gas station and get topography maps, right? And what a topography map does is it gives you the lay of land. It tells you elevation, tells you what routes to take, tells you which ones are good or bad, made for ATVs, not made for ATVs, made for hiking, biking, all that kind of stuff. But it gives you where you need to go, ups and downs, that kind of thing. And what we have done in the last 50 to 100 years in evangelicalism is we've taken the law of God and flattened it all. So there's no hierarchy of sin. And this is common. I mean, we all tend to employ this when we talk about sin in our own lives and we're trying to share the gospel with somebody else. Well, me too. I'm a sinner too. We're all the same. And we don't understand how the law of God has gradated sins. We're unable to discuss certain sins as worse than others. Hear me clearly. All sin, every sin, is worthy of condemnation before a holy God. That's not in question. They're all equal. They're all treason against the living God. The question is, are some more deviant and do some degrade society more than others? According to the law of God, absolutely. There's different consequences for sin. There's different emphases. And so the law of God is complex. And what we've done is we've flattened every sin, taken a third way approach to where now every sin is the same. In fact, it oftentimes perverts the law of God, and this is how it played out in 2020. We have John Piper leading up to the 2020 election, and he's trying to help Christians navigate what are we doing when we vote? What are we doing when we vote? And so he looks at the two candidates, Democratic one, Republican one, and he's trying to compare their sins. He's trying to compare their sins. And what he writes is on one side, you've got a politician on the Democrat side who supports abortion, transgenders, and that kind of stuff. On the other side, you've got a really narcissistic, prideful guy. And it leads him to such a moral conundrum that he concludes that the Republican Party's pride is more damnable and high-handed against God than abortion and transgenderism. And so you can't do that. So that one's more preferable. That's insane biblically. That's like not how we read our Bible. Pride, of course, is sin. But to talk about the degradation of our neighbor, if somebody says a bad word or has a prideful attitude, which is worse, killing them or saying a mean thing? And I'm not making excuses for any candidate at all. What I'm trying to show you is how this works out in evangelicalism when we don't understand God's law and we don't understand the terrain. And this winsomeness kind of plays on it.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share with a friend. Truth matters.